He saw me messing around with guitar when we were on the road. In those days, it was just Elvis, and I practiced. I would learn the basic chords, with a couple of minors in there.
Elvis Presley's Bodyguard breaks silence. The night. Everything changed. The Bodyguard had kept this story buried for decades, tucked away in the same quiet place where he stored every moment he swore he'd protect for Elvis. But age has a way of loosening the grip on old promises, especially the ones that once felt like sacred duties. So when he finally began to speak, his voice carried the weight of a man who had spent years balancing loyalty with regret. And the moment he opened his mouth, he didn't talk about fame or music or glory. He went straight to the night. He said, changed everything. A night inside Graceland that he believed revealed more about Elvis Presley than the world ever saw. He began by describing the atmosphere in the mansion that evening, a tension thick enough that he noticed it the moment he stepped inside. Graceland was usually alive. Music somewhere in the background, friends drifting through rooms, staff moving with familiar rhythm. But that night, the house felt suspended, as though everyone inside had agreed to speak softer, move slower, pretend nothing unusual was happening. The Bodyguard couldn't explain it at first, but he sensed something was wrong long before he knew why. Elvis wasn't on the main floor as he usually was at that hour. He wasn't laughing with friends or tinkering at the piano. Instead, he had isolated himself in his private area upstairs, a place the bodyguards only approached if summoned. That wasn't entirely unusual. Elvis valued solitude, but the stillness felt different. It carried an unease that made the bodyguard pause at the bottom of the stairs, listening for any sound, any sign of what kind of night it was going to be. Whispers drifted through the hallways, faint but unmistakable. Members of the entourage talking in low tones, glancing toward the staircase with the kind of anxious energy people have when they're bracing for something. The Bodyguard had seen these men in every mood possible, from celebration to fear, but he had never seen them quite like this. It was as if they were waiting for a storm they hoped wouldn't break, but suspected already had. He approached one of them quietly and asked what was going on. The man shrugged it off, offering a half-hearted smile, but the Bodyguard saw the truth in his eyes. They were worried, not about Elvis's temper, not about a business meeting gone wrong. This was something deeper, something personal, something tightening around Elvis in ways none of them could control. When the Bodyguard finally received a call from upstairs, his stomach tightened. Elvis wanted him specifically. That alone was telling. Elvis normally made requests casually, through whoever happened to be nearby. Tonight, he had chosen the one man he trusted with the darkest moments, the one who understood when to speak and when silence was the only kindness. He climbed the steps with a careful pace, each footfall echoing louder than he expected. At the landing, the hallway was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a lamp near Elvis's door. He knocked once and waited. A long pause followed, long enough for him to wonder if he should knock again. And then Elvis's voice, strained but steady, told him to come in. The Bodyguard would later say that the sight before him was the moment he realized the world's image of Elvis Presley and the man himself had never been further apart. Elvis sat at the edge of his bed, shoulders slightly slumped, hands clasped as though he were trying to hold something together inside himself. There was no performance in his posture, no attempt to hide whatever had shaken him. For the first time in years, Elvis looked like someone carrying a truth too heavy to keep lifting alone. He didn't begin with explanations. He didn't ease into the conversation. He simply looked at the bodyguard with an expression that made the older man's chest tighten. A mixture of fear, resignation, and something that resembled clarity. And in a low voice, Elvis said there was something he needed to admit, something he had kept hidden even from those closest to him. The bodyguard sat beside him, bracing for a confession he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Elvis took a breath, searching for words he had never spoken aloud. And just when he finally began to speak, just when the truth started to take shape, a sound from the hallway interrupted them. Voices, hurried footsteps, something shifting in the tension outside that instantly tightened Elvis's expression. The bodyguard turned toward the door, instinctively reaching for the handle. That was the moment, he said, when everything changed. The bodyguard would later say that what happened upstairs at Graceland that night didn't come out of nowhere. It felt sudden, shocking, unforgettable, but it had been building for months, maybe years, in ways no one wanted to acknowledge. To understand that moment by the bedroom door, you had to rewind to the slow, quiet unraveling he'd watched from just a few steps behind Elvis, night after night. He'd seen Elvis tired before. Touring, performing, filming, it all took a toll, and there were days when exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. But this was different. In the months leading up to that night, the bodyguard noticed a kind of heaviness that simple rest couldn't fix. Elvis would drift through Graceland as if each room carried a memory he couldn't escape. He joked a little less, stayed up a little longer, stared off a little more. For everyone else, it was easy to blame the workload, the schedule, the demands that never stopped. For the bodyguard, who watched him closely, it felt like someone was slowly turning down the light inside him. He remembered nights when Elvis would sit at the piano, fingers resting on the keys without playing a note, as if the music was still there, but trapped somewhere just out of reach. Sometimes he'd tap out a melody, only to stop halfway through and lean back in silence. The bodyguard never pushed him to keep going. He just stood nearby, pretending to be on watch, while in reality, he was listening to the pauses more than the notes. Those pauses were growing longer. The pressure around Elvis didn't come from one place. It surrounded him. There were business decisions being made in offices he rarely visited, contracts signed with his name at the bottom that he hadn't fully read, plans drawn up for tours, and appearances that treated him more like an asset than a man. The bodyguard wasn't privy to every detail, but he saw the stress in the way Elvis spoke when the meetings ended. He would run a hand through his hair, sigh deeply, and ask the same question more than once. Do they really think I can just keep going like this? At first, people brushed off those comments. Elvis had always carried a heavy load. But over time, the bodyguard noticed a new tone creeping into his voice when he talked about the future. A tone that sounded less like ambition and more like apprehension. He began canceling small things, avoiding gatherings that once energized him, choosing instead to stay in his room with the door closed. The house, which used to revolve around his presence, slowly started to orbit around his absence. Then he said something that made the bodyguard's stomach sink. Elvis admitted he was afraid, not of the crowds or the stage, but of the people who claimed they were protecting him. He confided that he had found out about decisions made without him, contracts that locked him into obligations he didn't remember agreeing to, financial arrangements he barely understood. He felt cornered, like a man slowly being bricked into a wall while everyone insisted They were building him a palace. The bodyguard tried to reassure him, but Elvis lifted a hand, stopping him. He wasn't looking for comfort anymore. He wanted someone to hear him without glossing over the weight of his words. He said he felt watched, managed, and nudged in directions that didn't feel like his own. There was a sadness in his voice when he admitted that somewhere along the way, the people around him stopped asking, "What does Elvis want?" and started asking, "What can we get Elvis to do next?" The bodyguard had no script for this conversation. He had guarded Elvis from fans, stalkers, and strangers, but he had no training for guarding him from the life built around him. For years, his job had been to keep the outside world from breaking in. Now he was realizing that the hardest damage to stop was coming from inside the walls of Graceland itself. Then came the part he said he would never forget. Elvis looked him directly in the eye and asked a question that cut deeper than any confession. "Do you think they'd still be here if I wasn't Elvis Presley?" It wasn't a rhetorical line. He waited for an answer, searching the bodyguard's face for something honest. For a moment, the man didn't know what to say. He knew there were people who loved Elvis, truly loved him. He also knew there were others who loved what Elvis could provide, and those lines had blurred so thoroughly over time that even Elvis himself couldn't see where one ended and the other began. Before he could form a reply, a commotion broke the stillness. Someone called from down the hall, urgency in their tone. The bodyguard felt the shift instantly. The fragile honesty of the moment snapped, replaced by the familiar rush of panic that came when something went wrong upstairs. He glanced toward the voice, then back at Elvis, who seemed to steel himself in an instant, like a man pulling his mask back on before stepping out on stage. The next minutes unfolded in a blur that would replay in the bodyguard's mind for the rest of his life. He moved through the hallway with one part of his brain in professional mode, assessing, reacting, responding, while another part replayed Elvis's question over and over. He remembered the look on people's faces as he passed them, some scared, some tense, some wearing the expression of those who knew things had gone too far, but had no idea how to stop it. What exactly happened in those rooms that night, the bodyguard would describe carefully, choosing his words with the weight of someone who had lived with them for decades. He spoke of raised voices, frantic calls, and a sense that everything they had been trying to hold together had finally begun to crack. He described seeing Elvis not as the invincible king everyone expected, but as a man whose body and spirit had been pushed past their limits. He remembered the silence that followed the chaos, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but heavy. He stood in that stillness knowing, in a way he had refused to admit before, that something had shifted permanently. Elvis could still smile, still perform, still move through the motions of the life built around him, but the bodyguard sensed that a line had been crossed that night. They hadn't lost him physically yet, but something inside him had stepped away. Years later, when he finally broke his silence, he said that was the moment he knew they weren't just protecting a star anymore. They were watching a man disappear behind the weight of his own legend. And no matter how many stories were told about that era, none of them, in his mind, ever truly captured what was lost in that single, fragile night. In the days that followed that night at Graceland, the bodyguard said the house took on an atmosphere he had never felt before. It wasn't panic, not exactly. It was something quieter, more controlled, as though everyone had silently agreed to bury the night under layers of routine. People moved through the mansion with carefully measured expressions, speaking in tones too light, too careful, as if pretending things were normal could make them so. But beneath that thin layer of calm, tension pulsed through the air like a reminder of what they were all trying not to face. He remembered how Elvis appeared the next morning, put together, composed, almost eerily calm. To anyone else, it might have looked like resilience. But the bodyguard saw something different, the unmistakable stillness of a man who had retreated inward. Elvis didn't mention the conversation they'd had the night before, didn't acknowledge the chaos that had erupted afterward. He moved through the house like someone who had learned, once again, to conceal the heaviness he carried. And the entourage, relieved by his silence, quickly settled back into the roles they understood best. But the bodyguard couldn't shake the memory of Elvis's question. It echoed in every room he entered, every meeting he observed, every hush that fell when Elvis wasn't present. He watched people debate his schedule and discuss commitments with a confidence that no longer sat right with him. They talked about ticket sales, deadlines, appearances, everything except whether Elvis was in any condition, physically or emotionally, to keep giving what they demanded of him. There were moments he considered pulling someone aside, saying outright that Elvis needed rest, boundaries, protection from the very machine built around him. But every time he imagined the conversation, he remembered the way certain eyes hardened when anyone questioned the plan. Elvis's world was an ecosystem of dependence. If he stopped, dozens of lives would be shaken. And the fear of losing access to him, or losing the benefits that came with it, had made some of the people closest to him hold on tighter, even as he slipped further away. What haunted the bodyguard most was how quickly the truth of that night began to dissolve inside the mansion. Within a few days, the incident had been discussed, minimized, and folded into a narrative that made everyone more comfortable. It wasn't denial exactly. It was a kind of emotional self-preservation, a collective rewriting of events that allowed them to move forward without confronting the deeper reality. Elvis's exhaustion became a long week. The tension in the house became everyone just being tired. His confession of fear became Elvis worrying too much. The bodyguard watched this unfold with an ache that never faded. He knew Elvis didn't need grand interventions or dramatic confrontations. He needed people willing to see past the icon and into the man who was asking for help without ever raising his voice. But day after day, the myth of Elvis Presley proved louder than the man himself. The music played, the phones rang, plans resumed, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Elvis continued to dim in ways that were visible only to those who stood close enough to notice. The bodyguard said that as the years went by, he replayed that night more times than he could count. Not because of the chaos or the fear, but because of the honesty Elvis had allowed himself in those brief minutes before everything unraveled. That raw, unguarded moment when Elvis stripped away the performance and let someone see the weight he was carrying became the memory that stayed with him the longest. It was the moment he realized how isolated Elvis had truly become, even in a house full of people. He didn't speak publicly for a long time. Part of it was loyalty, part of it was grief, and part of it was the belief that talking about that night would reduce Elvis to a headline or a cautionary tale, neither of which felt worthy of the man he had known. But silence has its own weight, and over the years, he began to understand that telling the truth wasn't betrayal. It was a kind of protection, one he hadn't been able to offer Elvis when it mattered most. So when he finally broke his silence, he didn't do it to expose scandal or point fingers. He did it because that moment in the hallway The one where Elvis asked whether the people around him would stay if he wasn't Elvis Presley, was too important to vanish behind the carefully curated memories the world preferred. He believed people needed to understand the cost of being a legend, the loneliness that shadows even the brightest lights, and the human being beneath the myth who had asked one simple, heartbreaking question. "I protected him in life," he said. "This is my way of protecting him in death." If this story opened your eyes to the man behind the legend, share your thoughts below. Should more of Elvis's hidden truths be told? Let me know which untold moment you want uncovered next. And don't forget to subscribe for more revealing, emotionally powerful stories from the world's most iconic figures.